The thunder arrived first. It came from deep beneath the earth, a rumble that climbed through the wooden floorboards and settled into bone. Annalisa Hartmann felt it in her spine before she heard it with her ears. The sound grew, mechanical, relentless. The kind of sound that meant the world was about to change, whether you wanted it to or not. She was 23 years old. She had learned, over the past 4 years, that change always came violently. The barracks smelled of unwashed bodies and fear. It always had. The single window, grimy with years of accumulated filth, filtered the pale April sunlight into something grey and lifeless. Through that window, Annalisa could see dust clouds rising in the distance, backlit by morning light. The clouds were moving closer. Behind her, Liesl made a small sound. 19 years old and still carrying the terror of a girl who'd learned too young that the world had teeth. Her hands twisted the fabric of her dress, the same nervous habit that had worn permanent creases into the grey cotton. 3 years of that gesture. 3 years of waiting for the next terrible thing. Margaret sat upright on her cot, spine straight despite everything. 28 years old and still carrying herself like the schoolteacher she'd been in another lifetime. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her thin blanket. "American tanks," Margaret said. Her voice was clinical, precise. The voice of someone documenting facts for a history that might not remember them. "They're coming through the main road." Annalisa didn't need the confirmation. She'd learned to read the language of approaching violence. The Wehrmacht had pulled out before dawn, their boots thundering through the hallways one final time. They'd destroyed documents, burned files, fled like rats from a sinking ship. They'd left everything behind, including the women. Annalisa moved without thinking. One step sideways, then another, until she stood between the approaching sound and the 2 younger women huddled on the narrow cots behind her. It was instinct now, the same protective stance she'd held since she was 19, since the day the soldiers came to her village and told her mother she was needed for essential war work. 4 years of learning that protection meant making yourself the first target, the most visible shield. "They're here," Liesl whispered. The mechanical roar grew deafening, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Annalisa could hear male voices, sharp, authoritative, English words she couldn't understand but recognized in her bones. The language of conquest, the language of men taking control of territory they'd just won. She'd heard German officers use that same tone, that certainty of power. Her body remembered what came next. It always came next. Liberation by enemy soldiers meant one thing, and one thing only, a continued nightmare under new masters, different uniforms, different accents, same hunger. Annalisa felt her shoulders pull back automatically, eyes down, hands clasped loosely at her sides, available but not eager, compliant but not broken. It was a careful balance that had taken months to master, the math of survival. Give them what they wanted before they took it violently. Minimize the damage. Toward them. Liesl's breathing became labored. She was good at the math now. Heavy boots crunched across gravel outside, multiple sets of them, moving with military precision toward the barracks. Toward them. Liesl's breathing became ragged. Margaretta's teacher voice, usually so steady, cracked at the edges. "Whatever happens," Annalisa said quietly, "stay behind me." She knew it was pointless. There was nowhere to run. The barracks had no back door, no escape route. They'd learned not to look for such things anyway. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Hope got you killed. The door handle turned, rusted metal squealing. Annalisa straightened her spine and lifted her chin slightly. Not defiant, never defiant, but present, visible. She'd learned it was better to be seen immediately than to be discovered hiding. Men who found you hiding assumed you had something to be ashamed of, something that needed punishing. Sunlight flooded the dim barracks as the door swung wide. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, American uniform, clean, pressed. Behind him, more soldiers. Young men with fresh-shaved faces and khaki that smelled of soap and starch instead of sweat and cigarettes and the particular stink of men who took what they wanted. The officer in the doorway paused. His eyes moved from Anneliese to Liesel to Margaret. She watched his face carefully, reading the language written there. She'd become fluent in that language, the small movements that told you whether violence was coming fast or slow, but something was different. His expression shifted. Shock, maybe. Then recognition. Then something else entirely. Something that looked almost like grief. He spoke quietly to the soldiers behind him. Then did something impossible. He stepped back. Without entering their space. Without crossing the threshold, without claiming the territory he'd just won. The officer's hands were empty when he raised them, palms forward, a gesture Anneliese didn't understand. "You're safe now," he said. The words were German, heavily accented, but German, practiced. Anneliese felt something crack in her chest, a tiny fissure in the wall she'd built around her expectations. Every promise made by men in power had ended in betrayal. Always, but this man hadn't even crossed their threshold. Another soldier appeared beside the officer, younger, barely older than Liesel. He carried something in his arms, folded fabric, grey wool. The young soldier approached slowly, each step deliberate, announced. Then he did something that made Anneliese's breath catch. He extended his arms, offering, not taking. Blankets, clean blankets. The smell hit her before the sight registered fully. Soap. Clean soap. Not sweat. Not fear. Not the particular smell of violence that had soaked into every fiber of the fabric in this place for 4 years. Just soap. The young soldier's hands trembled slightly as he held out the blankets. His eyes were downcast, respectful, afraid of frightening them. "For you," he said in broken German. "Clean. Warm." Anneliese stared at the blankets, at the young soldier's shaking hands, at the officer who still stood in the doorway, refusing to enter uninvited. Behind her, Margaret made a sound. Not quite a gasp. Not quite a sob. Liesel whispered, "They're not." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak the hope aloud because hope was dangerous. But the blankets were real. The soap smell was real. And the men weren't moving closer. The officer spoke again, slowly, carefully. "My name is Sergeant Nathaniel Garrett. We're United States Army. The Wehrmacht is gone. You're under our protection now." Protection. Anneliese turned the word over in her mind. Examined it for the lie. The trap. Found nothing but the steady gaze of a man who looked like he'd seen things that aged him beyond his years. 40, maybe older. Hard to tell with soldiers. War wrote years onto faces that calendars couldn't count. Garrett gestured to the young soldier. "Private Elijah Crawford will show you to your quarters, clean quarters, with locks on the inside of the doors." Locks on the inside. Anneliese's throat tightened. Crawford set the blankets down just inside the doorway, not coming closer, not demanding gratitude, just placing them there and stepping back. Garrett's voice was gentle. "We have a truck waiting. When you're ready, no rush." Then he did it again. That impossible thing. He turned and walked away. Left them alone. Didn't station guards outside the door. Didn't wait to see if they'd comply. Just left. As if they were people who could be trusted to make decisions. The three women sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the blankets, at the open doorway, at the spring sunshine beyond. Finally, Margaret stood, moved to the blankets, picked one up with trembling hands. She pressed it to her face and inhaled. When she looked up, tears tracked through the dirt on her cheeks. "It smells clean," she whispered. "It actually smells clean." The truck bed was lined with canvas that didn't smell of diesel or unwashed bodies. Annalisa sat between Liesel and Margaret, their shoulders touching, formation they'd maintained through countless transports over the years. But this time, no one had separated them. No one had pointed at Liesel and dragged her to a different vehicle. No one had shoved Margaret toward an officer's transport. They were together. That small mercy felt so unexpected that Annalisa couldn't process it. Private Crawford had helped them climb up, helped without touching unnecessarily. He'd simply extended his hand, palm up, waiting for them to decide whether to accept. When Liesel had flinched away from the offered help, he'd quietly placed a wooden crate beside the tailgate instead. Made it a step. Let her climb up on her own terms. Now he drove the truck with careful attention to the road, avoiding potholes, slowing for rough patches. Through the canvas opening, Annalisa watched the Bavarian countryside roll past, fields scarred by tank treads, abandoned equipment rusting in drainage ditches, but still green, still growing. Spring didn't care about war. Camp Lucky Strike sprawled across a hillside like a temporary city. Rows of canvas tents and wooden buildings stretched in neat military lines. Wire fences surrounded the perimeter. Annalisa's stomach tightened as they approached the main gate. Gates were gates, fences were fences. Different uniforms didn't change the basic geometry of captivity. The truck stopped in front of a low wooden building. Crawford opened the tailgate and stepped back, giving them space to climb down on their own. Annalisa noticed how he kept his hands visible, how he announced each movement before making it. These were not the behaviors of men who took what they wanted without asking. Sergeant Garrett emerged from the building. His uniform was crisp despite the afternoon heat. His face carried lines that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, though he wasn't smiling now. He spoke to Crawford in English, then approached the women with careful, measured steps. "Building 7, he said in his careful German. "Clean, secure. No one will enter without your permission." There was that word again. Permission. Liesel made a small sound, quickly muffled. Garrett led them across the compound, past rows of tents where American soldiers looked up from evening activities. Some stared, others watched with expressions Annalisa couldn't quite read, but none of them called out crude suggestions. None made the gestures she'd learned to expect. They simply watched, then returned to their card games and letter writing. Building 7 was a converted barracks, 6 cots arranged along the walls, each with a folded blanket and a small wooden crate that served as a bedside table. The blankets were wool, thick, clean. The kind of softness that spoke of proper washing and care. Annalisa ran her fingers along the edge of one, felt something loosen in her chest at the simple luxury of clean fabric. Garrett pulled a sheet of paper from his jacket pocket, moved to the wall beside the door, tacked it up with practiced efficiency. "Rules," he said. The text was in German. Careful block letters. Someone had taken time with this. Made sure it was clear. Annalise read, "Rule number 1. No prisoner will be sexually assaulted or harmed. Rule number 2. No soldier may enter this building without permission from the occupants. Rule number 3. Meals will be delivered at 800, 1200, and 1,800 hours. You are not required to earn them. The words swam in her vision. Not required to earn them. Margaret stared at the posted rules with the intensity of someone trying to decode a foreign language. "This is," she began, then stopped, as if the words she needed didn't exist in any language she knew. A knock sounded at the door. All three women froze. Crawford's voice, young and nervous, came through the wood. "Soup, hot soup, for eating." Garrett opened the door. Crawford stood there with a metal pot and 3 bowls, his face flushed pink with the effort of speaking German. He set the pot on the floor just inside the door. Stepped back immediately. When he reached to hand Liesel a bowl directly, she flinched so violently she stumbled backward. Fell onto one of the cots. Crawford froze. His face went pale with horror at having frightened her. Garrett was beside him instantly. "Crawford," he said quietly in English, then switched to German. "We announce ourselves, we keep distance, we let them come to us." Crawford nodded rapidly, set the bowls on the floor beside the pot. "Sorry," he whispered in German. "Very sorry, no hurt, no hurt." They left, closed the door behind them. The 3 women sat in silence, staring at the steaming pot of soup. It smelled of vegetables and meat, rich, nourishing. But more than that, it had been given freely. Without demands, without expectations, Annalisa reached for a bowl with trembling fingers, half expecting someone to appear, to name the price she would have to pay for this kindness. No one came. Outside their window, she could hear American soldiers calling to each other in the gathering dusk. Their voices carried the easy camaraderie of men who slept safely at night. For the first time in 4 years, Annalisa let herself wonder. Maybe, just maybe, she might sleep safely too. The routine began the next morning at 8 o'clock precisely. 2 knocks on the door, firm but not aggressive. Crawford's voice, "Breakfast, may I enter?" Margaret, who'd slept closest to the door, called out, "Yes, you may." The door opened slowly. Crawford stepped just inside, set the tray on the floor, stepped back. "Good morning," he said in his careful German. Then, "Breakfast ready?" He was gone before they could respond. The pattern repeated at noon. At 6 in the evening, always the knock, always the question, always the respectful distance. On the second day, Crawford added a phrase, "Hope is good today." On the third day, Margaret corrected his grammar gently. "Hope you are well today." Crawford's face lit up. "Yes, hope you are well today, I learn, thank you." It was such a small thing, teaching a young soldier proper German. But Margaret smiled, actually smiled. Annalisa watched the interaction and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, exactly. She wasn't ready for hope. But something close to it. The absence of fear. Annalise was 19 when they came to her village. It was a cold morning in October 1941. The kind of cold that promised early winter. Her mother was making bread. The kitchen smelled of yeast and warmth. The soldiers were polite, professional. They spoke to her mother with respectful tones. "Your daughter is needed for essential war work, factory labor, good pay. She'll be well cared for." The lie was so clean, so official. Her mother had even packed her a small bag, her best dress, her grandmother's prayer book. The leather was worn soft from years of faithful hands, generations of prayers absorbed into the binding. Annalisa remembered kissing her mother goodbye, remembered the weight of the prayer book in her hands, remembered believing the promises. The prayer book was long gone now. Traded for an extra piece of bread during the terrible winter of 1943. When food was scarce and survival required surrendering everything beautiful. But Annalisa still remembered every word of the prayers her grandmother had taught her, every verse, every blessing. They lived in her memory like ghosts of a better world, even if she could no longer bring herself to speak them. 4 years of learning a different kind of prayer. The silent kind. The kind you whispered into darkness when hope was too dangerous to speak aloud. 4 years of learning that uniforms meant violence, that men in power took what they wanted, until now. Until blankets that smelled of soap. Until rules posted in German. Until young soldiers who asked permission. Annalisa lay on her cot on the 4th night in Building 7. Listened to Liesel's soft breathing, Margaret's precisely controlled sleep. Marveled at the absence, no heavy boots in the hallway, no crude voices demanding entrance, no sudden violence shattering the fragile peace of night. Just silence. Safe silence. She pressed her face into the clean wool blanket, inhaled the scent of soap, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to remember what it felt like to be 19, to believe in promises, to trust that tomorrow might be better than today. She was 23 now, 4 years older, 4 years harder. But maybe, just maybe, some promises were different. Some men kept their word. Outside, the spring night settled over Camp Lucky Strike. Stars emerged in the clearing sky. Somewhere in the distance, a soldier played harmonica. The melody was sad and sweet. Annalisa closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 years, she fell asleep without fear. On the 4th morning, Annalisa couldn't lift her right arm without wincing. The infection had been festering for weeks, a souvenir from a Wehrmacht officer who'd enjoyed leaving marks. She'd hidden it well, layering fabric to conceal the swelling. Visible wounds made men either more violent or more disgusted. Either way, showing weakness was dangerous. But pain had its own language, and Margaret had learned to read it. "Your shoulder," she said quietly. Not a question, an observation delivered with the gentle authority of someone who'd spent years caring for others. Annalisa tried to shrug it off. The movement sent fire down her arm. "It's nothing. It's infected," Margaret said. Her teacher voice. The one that didn't accept lies, even well-intentioned ones. That needs medical attention. The idea felt impossible. Help from soldiers, medical attention from men. These things had never been about healing. They'd been about control, about finding new ways to hurt, about debts that accumulated with interest. But the throbbing in her shoulder worsened as morning stretched into afternoon. The fever made her thoughts swim. And when Crawford arrived with lunch, Margaret did something Annalise never expected. She stepped forward, shoulders back, dignified. "Excuse me," she said in her precise German, then attempted English, the words careful and practiced. "Medical help, please." Crawford's boyish face creased with immediate concern. He set down the food tray, hurried away, returned minutes later with another soldier. This one moved differently. Compact build, efficient movements, a medical bag slung over his shoulder. His uniform bore the Red Cross insignia. His eyes were steady and kind. "Corporal Warren Hayes," he said. His German was significantly better than Garrett's, almost fluent. "I understand someone needs medical attention." When Annalisa reluctantly indicated her shoulder, Hayes nodded, opened his medical bag on the small table. But he didn't reach for her. Instead, he began pulling out supplies, setting them down one by one, explaining each item as it appeared. "Antiseptic solution," he said, showing her a brown bottle. "For cleaning the wound, it will sting, but it prevents infection from spreading." Another bottle, smaller. "Clean bandages, sterile." A tin container. Antibiotic powder. This will help fight the infection. He paused, looked directly at her. I need to examine the injury to treat it properly, he said. His voice was gentle, professional, the voice of someone who understood that bodies carried memories. Is that acceptable to you? The question hung in the air like something unprecedented. Acceptable to you, as if her acceptance mattered, as if she had the right to say no to a man who wanted to touch her. Annalisa felt her throat close, felt tears burn behind her eyes. 4 years. 4 years of never being asked. 4 years of hands that took without permission. 4 years of learning that her body wasn't hers to control. And now this man stood waiting, patient, respectful, asking. Yes, she whispered, then cleared her throat, said it again, stronger. Yes. Hayes's examination was clinical and gentle. His hands moved with practiced precision, explaining each step before he took it. I'm going to remove the fabric here. The infection is localized but significant. I'll need to clean it thoroughly. His touch was careful, impersonal, medical. There was no hunger in his expression, no calculation about what this attention might entitle him to later. He simply tended to her injury with the same focused care she imagined he would give any wounded soldier. The antiseptic stung exactly as he'd promised. Annalisa bit her lip to keep from crying out. I know, Hayes said quietly. I'm sorry, almost done. He applied the antibiotic powder with gentle pressure, wrapped the clean bandage with expert efficiency, secured it with medical tape. There, he said finally. Change the dressing daily, keep it dry. If you see red streaks extending from the wound, or if fever develops, have someone find me immediately. He packed up his supplies, stood, but didn't move to leave right away. The human body has remarkable healing capacity, he said. His voice carried something beyond medical knowledge, something that sounded like faith. When given proper care and safety, it knows how to repair itself. Both are available to you here. After he left, the 3 women sat in stunned silence. Finally, Liesl spoke, her young voice filled with something that might have been wonder. He asked permission before touching you. And explained everything, Margaret added, her teacher's mind cataloguing the unprecedented experience. Every step, every supply, every reason. Annalisa pressed her hand to the clean bandage, felt the absence of pain for the first time in weeks. Something was shifting, deep inside her chest, in the place where she'd learned to keep hope locked away because hope was dangerous. Maybe some promises were real, maybe some men kept their word. The days acquired a rhythm. Crawford's knock at 8 in the morning, his cheerful, broken German. Hope you are well today. Meals that appeared precisely on schedule. No one demanding payment, no one naming prices. Hayes checking the bandage each afternoon. His careful hands, his quiet reassurance that healing was happening. That her body remembered how to be whole. On the 7th day, Crawford brought something unexpected along with breakfast. A sketch pad, pencils, clean paper bound in simple cardboard. He set them on Liesl's cot with careful reverence. You say you like draw, he said. His German was improving. Before, you say you like art, so, drawing things. Liesl stared at the sketch pad. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She couldn't finish. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Crawford looked panicked. Is wrong? Is bad? No, Margaret said quickly. It's good, very good. She's happy. Crawford's face broke into a smile, wide and genuine. The kind of smile that suggested home and safety and a world where kindness was normal. Good, he said, is good. That evening, Liesl sat on her cot with the sketch pad. Her pencil moved across the page with tentative strokes at first, then stronger, more certain. Annalise watched from her own cot. saw Liesel's face relax, saw the terror that usually lived behind her eyes recede slightly. "What are you drawing?" Margaret asked gently. Liesel turned the pad around. It was Crawford, captured in simple lines. His young face, his nervous smile, his hand extended, holding a wooden crate beside the truck tailgate. The moment he'd given Liesel a choice. "So I remember," Liesel whispered. "So I remember not everyone hurts you." On the 9th day, Garrett appeared with papers, official forms bearing the Red Cross insignia. "Margaret," he said, using her full name, pronouncing it carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about your family, your sons." Margaret stood immediately, her spine straight, her voice steady, despite the hope that flickered across her face like lightning. "Twin boys," she said, 11 years old. They would be 11 now. They were placed in state custody when I was—" She stopped, couldn't finish the sentence. Garrett's weathered face softened. "The Red Cross has been very effective at reuniting families. I can't make promises about timing, but we'll do everything we can." He sat at the small table, pulled out a pen, began asking questions, names, birth dates, last known location. Margaret answered each one with precision, her teacher's mind keeping perfect records even when her heart was breaking. When Garrett finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Hope," he said, then corrected himself. "I hope we have good news soon." After he left, Margaret sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point only she could see. "They saved my garden flowers," she said suddenly. "In their last letter before I was taken, they wrote that they saved my garden flowers so I would have them when I came home." Her voice cracked on the last word. Annalisa moved to sit beside her, put her arm around Margaretta's shoulders. "You'll see them again," she said, and meant it. "You will." That night, for the first time since they'd arrived, the three women talked about something other than survival. Liesel mentioned that she'd once wanted to be a teacher, like Margaret. Before the orphanage, before Hamburg, before everything, Annalisa spoke haltingly about her mother's garden, how the roses climbed the cottage walls each summer, how the whole village smelled of them in June. Margaret described her son's laughter, the way they'd run to greet her each day after school, how they'd fight over who got to carry her books. Their voices grew stronger as they spoke, lost the whispered quality that had become second nature. Outside their window, the American camp settled into its evening routine, the sounds of safety and normalcy drifting through the spring air. For the first time in years, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. On the 11th morning, Annalisa noticed the change before she understood its source. Conversations stopped abruptly when soldiers passed Building 7. The easy laughter that had become familiar background noise grew sparse and strained. Crawford still brought breakfast, but his smile seemed forced. His eyes avoided theirs directly. Hayes still checked her bandage, but his usual calm demeanor carried tension she couldn't identify. Something had shifted in the camp's atmosphere. Garrett appeared just after breakfast. Behind him stood a soldier Annalisa hadn't seen before, compact, hard-bodied, shoulders that seemed to carry invisible weight. His eyes swept over the three women with an expression Annalisa recognized from years of reading men's faces for signs of danger. This wasn't the clinical assessment of Corporal Hayes. This wasn't the gentle concern of young Crawford. This was evaluation, judgment, the look of someone trying to determine guilt or innocence. "This is Corporal Declan O'Brien," Garrett said. His voice carried a note of warning, or maybe apology. "He'll be working with our unit for the next few weeks." O'Brien's gaze settled on each of them in turn. His face was angular, Irish features beneath the American uniform. Mid-20s, maybe, but his eyes looked older. "Ma'am," he said stiffly, nodding toward Margaret as the eldest. But his voice carried an undertone that made Liesel unconsciously step closer to Annalisa. After they left, uncomfortable silence settled over Building 7. The easy routine they'd begun to trust felt suddenly fragile, as if a single suspicious look could shatter the safety they'd barely begun to accept. The change became more pronounced over the following day. Guards who'd grown accustomed to casual conversation now maintained professional distance. Soldiers who'd smiled and waved across the compound now looked away. It was Hayes who finally explained what was happening. He arrived to check Annalisa's healing shoulder. His medical bag in hand, his typically calm demeanor strained at the edges. "There's been new information," he said quietly as he examined the wound. His hands were steady, but his voice wasn't. "Film footage, documentation, from the concentration camps." Annalisa felt her chest tighten. They'd heard whispers over the years, terrible rumors that seemed too horrific to believe. Work camps where people were sent and never returned, mass graves, systematic murder. But whispers and documented reality were different things entirely. "Some of the men are struggling," Hayes continued. He applied fresh bandages with gentle precision. "They're trying to understand the difference between victims and perpetrators. It's difficult for them to process that German women could suffer under the same system that committed such atrocities." His words were careful, diplomatic. But Annalisa heard what he wasn't saying. The soldiers were looking at them differently now, seeing them not as victims but as potential accomplices. German women in a German war. How could they not be guilty? That afternoon, the entire camp assembled in the main yard. Garrett came to Building 7 personally. "You don't have to attend," he said, "but I think you should. I think you need to understand what they've seen." The three women followed him to where a white sheet had been hung against the side of a building. A film projector sat on a table. Soldiers gathered in silent rows. The footage began. Black and white images. Grainy and terrible. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, names that would become synonymous with evil. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Mass graves being excavated by German civilians forced to witness what had been done in their name. Living skeletons behind barbed wire. Children with hollow eyes and numbers tattooed on their arms. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Ovens, piles of shoes, eyeglasses, human hair. The systematic industrial murder of millions. Annalisa watched. Felt something collapse inside her chest. Not surprise, but a terrible confirmation of humanity's capacity for evil. She'd known evil intimately, had lived with it pressed against her skin for 4 years, but seeing it documented, made official, proven beyond whispers and rumors, it made her own survival feel like complicity. Around her, soldiers wept openly. Some vomited, others sat rigid with rage barely contained. And in the back row, Corporal Declan O'Brien watched the screen with eyes that burned. O'Brien appeared at their door the next day. Not Garrett's measured approach, not Hayes's gentle professionalism, not Crawford's nervous kindness, just O'Brien. Alone, carrying a manila folder. His face was stone. "I need to ask you some questions," he said. His German was heavily accented, forced through anger, barely held in check. Margaret straightened to her full height. "What kind of questions?" O'Brien opened the folder, pulled out photographs, grainy black and white images that made Liesel gasp and turn away. The images from yesterday's film, made permanent, undeniable. Emaciated figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, children's hollow eyes, staring at nothing. "What did you know?" O'Brien asked. His voice was tight. "What did you see?" The photographs lay between them like accusations. Annalisa stared at the evidence of systematic murder. felt shame flood through her, not for what she'd done, but for what she'd survived while others had perished. "We knew we were nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We knew we didn't matter. They told us we were lucky, that we could have been sent to work camps instead. We thought—" Her voice broke. "We thought they meant factories." "That's not an answer," O'Brien pressed, his anger fully visible now. These camps were all over Germany. People had to know, people had to see. Liesel began to shake, her fragile stability crumbling. "They told us we were serving the Reich," she said through tears. "They told us our sacrifice kept worse things from happening to other women. We believed we were paying the price so others wouldn't have to." Margaretta's teacher instincts fought through her own breaking composure. "How do you explain evil to people drowning in it?" she said, each word precise despite the pain. "We were told lies, fed lies, surrounded by lies until we couldn't see truth anymore." O'Brien stared at them. His disgust felt like a physical blow. "My brother died liberating Dachau," he said. His voice cracked. "Patrick O'Brien, 28 years old. He saw children in those camps, babies. How do I honor his memory while treating you with kindness? How do I know you're not just as guilty as the rest of them?" The question hung in the air like a verdict. Annalisa felt years of carefully constructed survival crumble. The shame she'd fought so hard to contain came flooding back, mixed now with terrible knowledge. While they'd been trapped in their own hell, others had suffered worse, had died in ways that made her torture seem almost merciful by comparison. "Maybe we are," she said finally. The words scraped her throat raw. "Maybe surviving makes us guilty. Maybe we should have died instead." O'Brien gathered the photographs, stood, left them with their shame and the horrible certainty that their brief taste of dignity had been a cruel illusion. They huddled together on the cots as darkness fell. No longer 3 women healing. 3 conspirators in history's greatest crime, marked by survival as surely as if guilt had been tattooed on their foreheads. Outside their window, the American camp continued its evening routines. But now those sounds felt distant, condemning, as if even the spring air carried judgment against them. The silence in Building 7 had weight now, pressing down like a physical thing. And for the first time since liberation, Annalise wished the Americans had never come. For 3 days after O'Brien's interrogation, the women barely spoke. They moved through their routines like ghosts haunting their own lives, accepting meals with downcast eyes and whispered thanks, waiting for the inevitable moment when someone would realize the truth about what they were and take away even these small mercies. Annalisa found herself cataloguing every kindness she'd received since arriving at Camp Lucky Strike, preparing to surrender each one as payment for the crime of surviving when others had not. The clean blankets that smelled of soap, the gentle medical care, the simple dignity of being asked for permission, all of it felt stolen now. Luxuries she had no right to claim. She was alive. Millions weren't. The math was simple, brutal, undeniable. Liesel had retreated into the catatonic silence that had once been her primary defense mechanism. She rocked slightly on her cot, stared at the wall with unseeing eyes. The sketchpad Crawford had given her lay untouched on the floor. Margaret sat rigid and watchful, her teacher's mind working frantically to find some logical framework that could make sense of guilt and innocence in a world where both had become meaningless concepts. When Crawford brought meals, they barely acknowledged him. His cheerful German died in the heavy air. His young face grew troubled. When Hayes came to check Annalisa's shoulder, she refused to let him touch her. "I don't deserve medical care," she said flatly. Hayes's steady eyes filled with something that might have been pain. "Everyone deserves medical care," he said quietly. "That's not negotiable," but he didn't insist, just left fresh bandages on the table and walked away. On the fourth morning, Garrett appeared in their doorway. Behind him stood O'Brien. Both men carried the weight of decisions made and consequences accepted. Annalisa felt her heart sink toward her stomach. This was it, the moment she'd been expecting, the reckoning. The official judgment that would strip away their temporary sanctuary and confirm what O'Brien's photographs had already proven, that German women who had survived the war were inherently suspect, complicit by virtue of breathing. She stood, positioned herself in front of Liesel and Margaret one last time. The same protective stance she'd held since she was 19. If they were going to be condemned, she would face it first. But Garrett's expression wasn't what she expected. His weathered face carried determination, purpose, something that looked almost like defiance. He stepped forward, his hands steady on a document folder. "What happened in those camps?" he said, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. "That's not on you." The words hit Annalisa like physical blows. Garrett's eyes moved to each of them in turn. "What happened to you?" "That's not on you either." Annalisa felt her legs weaken, felt the carefully constructed walls of guilt begin to crack. "But we're German," she whispered. "You're victims," Garrett interrupted. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd seen enough evil to recognize it clearly. "You survived hell. You're not the enemy. You're the evidence of what we've been fighting against." He turned slightly, including O'Brien in his gaze. O'Brien stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions that seemed to war with each other in real time. The anger that had defined their previous interaction was still there, but something else had joined it, something that looked like shame. "How old were you?" O'Brien asked suddenly, his voice stripped of accusation, halting, almost afraid of the answer. "When they took you," he was looking at Annalisa. She felt her throat close. 19. The word hung in the air. O'Brien's face crumpled, as if some internal dam had finally given way. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted. "Jesus," he breathed, then forced the German words. "My sister, she's 19 now, at home in Dublin, Ohio. Her name is Kathleen." His voice broke. "When I look at you, all I see is her, safe, free. And I think, what if the war had gone differently? What if she'd been born German instead of American? She could be you, you could be her." He wiped his eyes roughly. "Patrick died so girls like Kathleen, like you, wouldn't have to live in a world where this happens, and I almost dishonored that by becoming exactly what he fought against." O'Brien extended his hand toward Annalisa, not to take anything from her, but to offer support, to lift her up rather than pull her down. The gesture was small but monumental. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "I let my brother's death make me cruel. I let grief blind me. Patrick died fighting this system, not fighting you, fighting the men who hurt you. He would be ashamed of me right now. He would want me to help you, not hurt you more." Annalisa stared at the outstretched hand. 4 years of learning that hands meant violence, that offers meant traps, that kindness was always a lie. But O'Brien's eyes held no deception, just raw grief and regret, and the desperate need to make something right in a world gone wrong. She reached out, their hands met. And for the first time since the photographs, Annalisa let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, survival wasn't a crime. Garrett opened the folder in his hands. Not charges, not condemnation, Red Cross paperwork, official forms bearing stamps and signatures, repatriation documents. "We've located your sons, Margaret," he said gently. Margaret made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Twin boys," Garrett continued, 11 years old, safe in American custody in Munich, healthy, asking about their mother every single day. Margaretta's careful composure finally shattered. She wept, not from pain or shame, but from the foreign sensation of hope fulfilled, of maternal love rewarded rather than punished. Liesel reached for her with shaking hands. For the first time in days, her young face showed something other than terror. Annalisa felt tears burn down her own cheeks. "They're alive," Margaret whispered through her sobs. "My boys are alive." Garrett pulled more papers from the folder. "You'll all be transferred to the repatriation center next week. We've arranged safe transport, housing. The Red Cross will help you reunite with families, find work, rebuild." He paused. "Let the information settle." "But I want you to understand something before you go," he said. His expression carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This matters. What happened here matters." He looked at each of them in turn. "Tell people what you saw at Camp Lucky Strike. Tell them some of us remembered you were human when the world forgot." Annalisa felt something shift inside her chest, not the cracking of breaking, but the settling of pieces finding their proper places. She had been 19 when they stole her life. But she was 23 now, and 23 was old enough to choose what to do with whatever life remained. "Tell your families," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Tell them that 3 German women will spend the rest of their lives proving that mercy is stronger than cruelty." The days that followed carried a different quality. O'Brien returned the next morning, knocked on the door with careful respect, asked permission to enter. He brought a photograph, faded, creased from being carried close. "My brother Patrick," he said, holding it out so they could see. A young man in uniform, smiling, eyes full of idealism and hope. "He believed we were fighting for something," O'Brien said quietly. "Not just against Hitler, but for the idea that every person has dignity, that no one deserves to be treated as less than human." He looked at Annalisa. "He would have wanted to help you, and I dishonored his memory by doing the opposite." Over the following days, O'Brien became a fixture in Building 7. He helped Margaret write letters to her sons. His handwriting was steadier than hers, less shaky with emotion. "Dear Mama," he wrote as she dictated, "we saved your favorite flowers from the garden, the yellow roses. We pressed them in books so they would last until you came home." Margaretta's voice trembled, but she kept speaking, kept building the bridge back to her children with words and hope. O'Brien taught Liesel basic English phrases. Patient, encouraging. "My name is Liesel," she repeated carefully. "I am from Hamburg. I want to be a teacher." "Perfect," O'Brien said, his Irish accent making the words musical. "You'll teach circles around the rest of us." Liesel smiled, actually smiled, and when she picked up her sketch pad again, her pencil moved across the page with renewed purpose. She drew O'Brien sitting at the table with Margaret, his head bent over the letter, his face concentrated and kind. "So I remember," she said, when she showed it to Annalisa. "So I remember that people can change. That anger can become kindness." Hayes continued his daily visits, checking Annalisa's shoulder with professional care. "Healing nicely," he said on the 15th day. "The infection is completely gone. You'll have a scar, but the wound is closed." Annalisa looked at the clean skin, the pink line where trauma had been. "Scars are proof of survival," Hayes said quietly. "They're not something to be ashamed of." She met his steady gaze. "Thank you for everything, Hayes smiled. You're welcome, though I think you did the harder work, learning to trust again. That takes more courage than I'll ever have. Crawford brought Liesl more art supplies, better pencils, colored pastels. You are artist, he said proudly in his improving German. Artists need good tools. He also brought books for Margaret, teaching manuals salvaged from a nearby school. For when you teach again, he said, you will teach again, I know this. And he brought Anneliese something unexpected. Seeds, small packets of flower seeds. For your mother's garden, he said shyly. When you go home, you can plant new roses. Anneliese held the packets in her trembling hands, felt the weight of possibility they represented, new growth from old soil, life after destruction. Garrett made his rounds each evening, checking on them, ensuring they had what they needed. The repatriation center is ready, he said on the 25th day. You'll leave in 3 days. 3 days until their lives changed again. But this time, the change felt like moving towards something instead of running from it. Sergeant Garrett, Margaret said, why did you do this? Why did you treat us with such kindness when you could have just warehoused us like any other refugees? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Because Patrick O'Brien wasn't the only good man who died in this war, he said finally. Because every time we choose cruelty over mercy, the bad guys win, even after they've surrendered. He looked at them with his weathered, kind eyes. You three are proof that good people survived. That's worth fighting for. That's worth remembering. The morning of departure arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine. Anneliese packed the clean blanket Garrett had given her, folded it carefully, a symbol of safety to carry forward. Liesl's sketchbook was full now, every page covered with drawings, the visual testimony of their healing. Margaret clutched her son's letters, had memorized every word but couldn't bear to leave them behind. Crawford arrived to help carry their few belongings to the truck. When he reached for Liesl's bag, she didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward and hugged him. The young soldier's face went red. His eyes filled with tears. You showed me wooden crate can be kindness, Liesl said in careful English. I will not forget. Crawford understood the reference, the step he'd made so she wouldn't have to take his hand. His face crumpled. You taught me that permission matters more than help. I'll never forget that. Write to me, he managed to say. Please. I want to know you are safe. I will, Liesl promised. Hayes appeared to say goodbye, shook Anneliese's hand with firm respect. You taught me something important, he said, that healing requires permission, that bodies and souls need consent to repair. I'll carry that lesson for the rest of my career. Anneliese squeezed his hand. Thank you for seeing us as human, when it would have been easier not to. O'Brien came last. He stood at attention, gave them a formal salute. Military precision and deep respect, but his voice cracked when he spoke. Patrick would have loved meeting you. He believed in second chances, in redemption, in the power of choosing mercy over hate. He pulled something from his pocket, dog tags, military identification worn smooth by handling. I want Margaretta's sons to have these, he said, so they know good men fought for them, so they understand their mother survived because people chose to be better than their worst instincts. Margaret took the tags with trembling hands. I'll make sure they understand.